Hi, my name is Neil Davidson. I'm speaking to you today from Brisbane in Australia. Over the years, I've worked in many organisations, government organisations, industry, non-government organisations, conservation groups, and non-aligned groups that are trying to form. And in that time, I've found similar dynamics that seem to sometimes get in the way of how we might collaborate, and in the term recently given to me, co-liberate, free ourselves from the constraints required to unleash the creative potential in us. In trying to make sense of this, I've explored different frameworks. And some of those frameworks have led to diagrams that I've helped to mould together from different walks of life. And I've been asked by several friends to convert some of my comments that I've been making on Facebook and LinkedIn into a format that's more easily accessible. My hope is that through these videos, I can start to explain some of my diagrams, which I see as rich, context-based, rich pictures that actually enable people to see their own context through the eyes of a more generic framework. That said, there's always a difficulty in trying to convert something which is used in an emergent sense into a format that is then used as a static, one-off, linear process. So I'm hoping I don't lose too much of the intention of this, which would be to work with a group as their questions are emerging, and to play these slides as cards in and as the game changes, rather than in a linear format in the way that I have to present them here. I've tried to pick an order that will make them make more sense as they evolve, and it's, in this particular case, it's deliberately targeted at how to tackle the issues of wicked problems associated with social complexity in the context of a world of complex adaptive systems. We know that there are issues that can be ordered and made relatively simple by the application of rules and by the ways in which we treat the information and how we contextualize that. Once we've ordered something, we can plan it. Once we've planned it, we can resource it. Once we've resourced it, we can turn it into a project plan. There are also those issues which are more complicated that require different levels of agreement and different levels of certainty, and the flexibility of different personalities to hold that complication loosely. And of course, all of this is operating inside a nested system of which we are but part, which is the complex, adaptive, reflexive system of humanity, which can decide to choose, go different directions depending on its whim, its worldview, its direction, influences beyond the scope of the project. And of course, all of this is happening within a complex cosmological picture of nested systems from the universe compacting into us as individuals in the middle. I'm hoping that this series of slides and the way in which I describe them will assist people that are coming at this from different angles to see how framing it in this way might allow them not to put people in boxes, but to at least allow the individuals to see themselves in emerging systems context. A complex adaptive system can quite often evolve by seeing itself in motion. And obviously, if you're going to see yourself in motion, it would be handy to have a map, recognizing that the map is not the territory, but that the best map is the best approximation of the territory as previously visited by yourself and others. And bringing those elements together is the key to contextual systems leadership, recognizing where you are in the landscape, what you might need to navigate, what you might need to avoid, how you might move forward. Some of the elements that are involved in this process require more poetry and motion than static script. And so the intention is so critical to how you actually move forward, not just the content. So I'm hoping that you recognize that while this series of slides is coming very much from the head in terms of process-based logic and ways in which you can see the world through that, that there are elements here where you need to be feeling into and intuitively engaging with the emerging system situation. So it's not just a fixed script that you can act out and pretend you've got it right, but more a transformative process where you are assuming the role of a humble participant observer and moving through that landscape, being attentive to the changing details, being attentive to the people that you might encounter, being attentive to the systemic situation as it evolves, and recognizing that you need to work out what is the next card to play, but that the map that you have developed or the map that you have been given is continually being refined by the actual praxis on the ground, the immersion of theory in practice, and the practice of theory in that immersion in that environment. So I hope that this series of slides is of some use to you, and I'm hoping that if this approach works, that I can convert others of my slides in the similar sort of way. So thank you for joining me here today. I've got about 8 slides to present, and I'll go through those as a PowerPoint presentation, talking to them, sharing screens, capturing it in video, and then using the pointer to move around so that you can see what's happening. Thanks very much for being here. So, as I said in the introduction, this series of slides is based on work that I've accumulated over the years and modified to suit the needs of the environments through which I was walking and working. When I tracked back this diagram, I found out that Stacey had developed a matrix where he was talking about 2 axes with close to agreement and certainty. So on the bottom axis is certainty, and on the side axis is agreement. And where you are close to agreement and close to certainty as a group or with another individual, things are relatively simple. You know what to do, you've agreed what you're going to do, and you're pretty certain that you're right. When you have something that's far from certainty, then you have complication. This complication requires you to do some more thinking about how do we make it more simple? How do we find the simplicity beyond that complication? And in this case, it's technically complicated because it's certain or not certain, and we can work that out through technology. When you have another axis here of agreement, when you're further from agreement, then it's socially complicated. When you have less agreement and less certainty, then things become complex. And in his model, he turned the arc around and had anarchy being beyond complexity. So simple, complicated, complex, and anarchy. When I convert that then to this diagram, which comes from 2010 from a paper by Patton on developing evaluation, applying complexity concepts to enhance innovation and use, you can see again that when you're close to agreement and close to certainty, then you have a simple area here which can be planned and controlled. If you're working in the technically complicated area, then you need to experiment, you need to coordinate the expertise required to reduce that complication. When you're working in an area that's socially complicated, you need to build relationships, you need to build trust, you need to identify and build common ground to enable you to make things easier to work with and to plan and control. Because if people are going to run off in different directions, then it's going to be very hard to get them to actually get to the implementation of the plan. And of course, we're dealing with complexity, especially with issues such as climate change, climate variability, collapsing ecosystems. We need to recognize that we are but humble agents in this process that is far more complex than we are. And the best that we can do is to convert that complexity into something that's complicated, and then to try and bring that complexity into a more simplified process to enable us to identify what needs to be done and how to do it. If we now carve up those axes into disciplines, such as the rays here coming out from the organised through the self-organising to the unorganised, and we recognise that these disciplines potentially overlap, but in many cases are adjacent. And this is the typical issue with a siloed organisation or a government department that doesn't collaborate with its adjacent department. So officially they're meant to be collaborating. In an organised space, they might be working together, but it's very hard sometimes to get across the different cultures that might exist within these disciplines. Okay, so coming from certainty, if we come out along the certainty axis, if we've got agreement and certainty on what needs to be done, then you could argue that that is relatively easy to administer. So administration, in a typical sense of how we run the ship, can fit in this bottom corner down here, close to agreement and close to certainty. A bit beyond that, we might have something such as the implementation of policy, because once we've agreed by policy endorsement of the cabinet in a government situation or a company board, once we've agreed what it is we're going to do, then we can actually implement it. And so this is the organised area where we know what we've got to do and we've been given instructions to do it and generally been resourced to do it. Beyond that area again, into less certain and less agreed ground, is the area where the policy writers reside. The policy writers are the ones who are identifying those issues that can be documented in a way to increase their certainty and to demonstrate that they have reached agreement. And at the point of agreement is when it's endorsed and it goes forward as government policy or as company policy. Of course, further out beyond the writing of the policy is the researching of the policy. These are the people that are scouting out ahead of the government agency or ahead of the organisation to identify where are those areas that we're going to be moving into shortly that we need to be identifying how to handle. And what does that look like when we bring that back into policy to be then implemented and administered. And when you go out even further, you'll find that in this self-organising space, this is generally where your innovators are. It's not to say that innovation can't happen in here, but this is a level of thinking, not necessarily, so it's not necessarily a functional unit, because an administrative person can still be innovative out in this space. But at this level, people can be thinking across the layers to say, how do we coordinate across disciplines to work out how to bring our ideas forward for the organisations? When you then look at within a discipline, you recognise that somebody with an idea from out here might have difficulty in communicating that directly from what's regarded often as too far out there. Oh, that person's too far out to be able to coordinate that idea, bring that back in. And so you need communication protocols which pass that down the chain. And this in many organisations is regarded as an administrative function, but it's also seen as red tape to innovation. It slows the rate of progress, and it means that to follow those processes is going to potentially slow down something that might need to be happening more rapidly, especially in the case of a rapidly changing discipline. So communication within the discipline can be happening from as far out as the self-organising area here, and we need communication protocols within the discipline to allow that to occur. So the question then becomes, if we've got an idea that's coming from somewhere outside the normal organised space, it's going to look like a different language unless you actually work out how to get through that process. But the question then becomes, who in our system actually knows best what it is we ought to be doing, especially if we're trying to anticipate what's coming, and especially if some of those players in here might not be aware of the broader perspective taken by the innovators and those looking for new policy and new ideas out in this area. So these different disciplines and departments or interest groups can be carved up into domains such as education, governance, economy, environment. When we actually recognise that the critical mass of thinking and effort for all of these areas is down here, okay? Governance, the educational, the economic and environmental critical mass is closer to organised than it is to self-organising. And this is something that many departments bemoan, is the fact that the innovation can't be brought through and turned into practical examples of how to move forward because there is a barrier, an invisible barrier between the language being used in the more, the closer organised areas of the organisation and those that are roaming more freely about in this more open space. The prospective minds or networks are potentially out in this self-organising space. So if you're running a grant agency, then the people that are coming in with the ideas are out here, but the people that administer are in here. So as these innovative new ideas are out here ready for the picking, some of them are going to be riper than others. Some of them are going to be more ready to be turned into an organised space and be funded than others. And a grant scheme quite often looks at how to bring these ideas into this area. The challenge is that quite often the people in this area can't see the transformative potential of these new ideas, especially if it challenges the way we do business around here, which is down in the organised area. This is the way we do business. What you're saying looks like a great idea, but it looks like it's going to challenge the way we do business. That's too risky politically, so we must keep your idea outside the organisation. However, the institutions have the resources to implement the ideas. So the self-organising networks of prospective minds must come to them for the resources, because most of the critical mass of funding is in this area here. As we've already said, the entrepreneurs have to seek that funding for ideas, and if they are successful, then it will be endorsed by a cabinet or a board in a way that allows them to receive the funding to turn their project, their idea, into a project plan to be then administered. As many entrepreneurs will tell you though, that quite often kills the project, because it now has to force these sorts of minds into these sorts of boxes. And there's an expectation that the prospective mind that's used to free roaming, free ranging exploration is now being forced to travel inside a vehicle that constrains them in how far and how fast they can move. And so a lot of the dynamics that occur between grant agencies and those that they provide grants to, and between innovation and those doing the implementation, or in some more coarse wording, between those doing the thinking and those doing the doing, there's going to be a gap. And that gap is quite often the chasm that people fall into, either in trying to seek funding and being prevented from accessing that concentration of resources and effort that is the dominant paradigm, and those that are at the innovation edge of the bell curve here, as opposed to where the critical mass of resources currently resides. And if we take this center point here as the center point of this axis, you can recognize that it can be ideas coming from anywhere around this center in multiple disciplines. I've just got these moving in one direction to make it simple to express. So the question then becomes, who screens the ideas and the directions? What is the frame of reference against which they're screening that? So for example, if the group that's looking at this is a group of climate denialists, then they're not going to see an idea that actually is trying to address climate change as something worthwhile funding. This is a common barrier to many governments globally at the moment, where prospective minds with better technologies and better approaches for self-organising are trying to bring their technologies and their ideas and their community development mechanisms into governments that are resistant to that change and potentially cruelling the chances of moving further forward faster, because the screening mechanisms are based on a set of assumptions which are different from what the science is telling us. I believe that what's actually needed is not just a critical mass that is traditionally based here, as we've already seen, that ties up all of that information, all of that administrative function, and all of that critical resourcing. We need a critical mass here to facilitate the emergence of new ideas and to resource it from the current critical mass. As we've already seen, though, the chances of getting the money from here depend on how we communicate through this barrier between those that think they're doing it already and those that have better ideas for how that might be done. And so, to me, there's a need for a system design network that seeks optimum future fitness. How do we become future fit if we're trapped inside current or old paradigm thinking and we're coming into a more disorganized or unorganized climate chaos through increased climate variability, or the need for new economies because old economies are failing? So when we're in this space of system design network, we're looking ahead to what is it we need to become to survive what's coming, and how do we convert that into what's needed to be implemented. In that, I believe, is the nub of transformational change, based on accessing resources trapped in the current system traps. So one of the issues we've got here is, how do we move the axes of our understanding from simple plan and control, where most people are currently trapped, through this zone of complexity to what is often referred to as the simplicity, the other side of complexity. Many people will say you've got to keep it simple, stupid, but it's not simple, it's complex. Now, when we're speaking to deeper truths, that will appear simple when you explain it in language that resonates with the heads and hearts of those that are doing that work. So the challenge here is, how do we convert that complexity through technically complicated, through socially complicated, into something that looks more simple. So we're actually exposing people to moving these axes to a new place that it better tackles the actual complexity, because we've allowed people to see it as not as complex as they originally thought. So we're changing their internal stance to the information being provided in a way that enables them to see the simplicity, the other side of their perceived complexity. So if it comes to this issue of survival, then it's a question of what do we want or what do we need? Sustainability is about meeting future needs, not just about meeting current wants. And yet, if you look at a market at the current state, in terms of this is after Roger's innovation curve, but what I've done is switched it around. As you'll notice, the innovators are on the right-hand side to keep my axes flowing from left to right. So this is just flipped around. The laggards in any system have change imposed on them because they haven't seen it coming, or they've resisted change. And quite often regulation is needed to prevent them from falling back into old habits. Those that can't change are generally forced out of business. The innovators, meanwhile, are already moving forward. They're the people that are shifting the status quo and the good business, because they've got they're explorers, they're designers with entrepreneurial minds, and they're looking for how to shift the market, how to shift forward. So they're exploring a space in front of the current curve. However, our government regulation quite often restrains those that are too risky or seem to be too risky in terms of current paradigm. If a government policy doesn't accept that, for example, climate change is happening, why would we invest in renewables, even though there are people ready to move into that space now? And so at this stage, government policy and regulation restrains those perceived as too risky to the current status quo. And there are multiple reasons for that. Those that can move forward from this imposed change generally form now a bipolar distribution. So there's those that are just viable, just meeting the business requirements. And of course, there are those scattered across this landscape that are doing more and moving further faster, sometimes because of corporate social responsibility, sometimes because of recognizing the need to moving forward from their own business's perspective, sometimes because they recognize the system's ethical imperatives required to be leaders in their field, not just late adopters or laggards being forced out of business. So there's a bunch here that are happy to stay the same, and their cultural narrative is we're doing it, it's okay, don't worry, there's nothing to worry about, things need to stay the same. And you need to recognize that this is a valid stance to take, especially for those that aren't aware of the need for change. And so we need to honour the fact that the majority of businesses and the majority of policy is going to be that happy to stay the same. If it ain't broke, don't fix it type camp. We also have a bunch of people that are recognising the need to move forward, and they're recognising the need to adapt. So your agile technologies and other areas are looking at how do we adapt to the changes we know are going to be imposed, so we're moving forward, and how do we start to move into this space that we haven't yet fully explored yet, but we've got people out there scouting around and telling us we need to start to think about how to shift. For those that are actually being forced out of business or are causing harm to the system, we need to work how to mitigate both the impacts on them and their impacts on us. Because if they're dragging us backwards, they're slowing us down. And so, to some extent, we have to transcend and then to include. Because if we waited until they're ready to move, we would not be moving further, faster, and fast enough to actually into this space to recognise that if we see something coming, we need to create a new transformative narrative. And in that new and transformative narrative is the recognition of the need to transform. This is different to adaptation. This is a deeper level of change. This is a quantum leap in performance. These are the sorts of things which enable people to move into new markets, but in the case of humanity, to move into new, safer zones, new, safer technologies, away from old polluting technologies towards the way forward in the future. These need to be necessarily more flexible. We need to have more flexible arrangements, but the potential is that we actually convert status quo into a new status quo, where the explorers and designers and their entrepreneurial minds are able to be implementing in that ordered space with the resources available, to allow us all to move forward faster and to recognise this as the new normal, the new norm in the middle of the new bell curve. So in this landscape diagram, again, based on the work of Glenda O. Yang and others from the Human Systems Dynamics Institute, I've switched the axis around so that it's again an arc reaching out to the right. From organised, which is orderly, predictable, process-friendly, through self-organising, which is emergent, adapting and pattern-friendly, to unorganised, which is unpredictable, random and surprising. And you'll notice the same axes here of agreement and certainty. So how sure are you, or how sure are they, that what they're doing now is actually the best way forward, given what's actually happening? So what happens if the weak signals that some of us are picking up, whether that's because we're more conscious or we're paying more attention, are right, and there are crises that are about to change what you thought or you thought you knew for certain? So if everything you've been doing is suddenly being thrown out the door, whether you're a farmer on the land and having to adapt to a changing climate, a drying climate, or whether you're somebody who's having to cope with greater hurricanes, frequency or intensity, or whether you're somebody coping with more floods than you expected, or whether you're somebody who's finding your economic market is shifting. How do you and how ready are you to move forward to a new area, to move these axes, ready to move forward to this new self-organising space, unless somebody has been exploring ahead? So do you wait for somebody to come along and give you heroic leadership and say, come on, you troops, let's all move forward? Or do you have to have a mechanism where you're trying to adapt individuals? Because quite often there are individuals inside these organisations, but a system needs to transform before going extinct. So this is basically a new order, a new way of being in this space. And as you saw before, it's that shift of the market or the electorate, in the case of a voting public, into a new space that better recognises new norms, because it's starting to cope with this less organised space. It has to be made more comfortable with what's emerging towards the more complex space. How do you help those that have the technical complexity or technically complicated issues sorted to bring that back into the organisation to move them forward, whether that be around software or a platform, or whether you're working with the social complexity of how to bring individuals together with new levels of understanding so that you can move forward collectively. Thank you very much for your time and attention today, and I hope that's of some value to you in the work that you do.